So the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, if we were to have gone back in time, if we were to step into a time machine and take ourselves to say 1910, somewhere in the British Empire, and asked a civilian, a citizen, about the war, they would have instinctively known we were referring to the Boer War between 1899 and 1902. This was a massive event for Britain and by extension, the British Empire. It left an indelible legacy on much of the British psyche that was only erased or perhaps changed by the cataclysmic events of the First World War. But between 1902 and 1914, before the First World War broke out, the Boer War occupied a huge cultural part of the British Empire. It was immortalized in film, on stage, in writing, in literature, and in art. This was a pivotal event indeed for the British Empire. And it's going to be my pleasure over the next 45, 50 minutes or so to explain to you the events of this war, because quite often we know the term the Boer War, but the actual events of it have rather been lost in the intervening century. And it's useful to just remind ourselves about the nature of this war, its complexities, and its key events. And having gone through those, I'll reflect briefly on some of the legacies that the war left on Britain and, of course, on the British Empire. So to begin with, we need to just consider a little bit about the events that had brought Britain and the Boer republics into conflict. And to do this, we need to step back quite far in time. We need to step back to the 1600s, when Dutch settlers founded Cape Town in southwest, what is now South Africa. Founded as a reprovisioning station for Dutch merchantmen heading to the East Indies and then returning. It struggled to attract immigration through the 1600s, 1700s. It was not a popular birth. Picked up some immigration from Dutch settlers, German settlers, and also French Huguenots. But its population was only about 40,000 white citizens at the end of the Napoleonic Wars when Britain annexed Cape Town and indeed Cape Colony, having already captured it by armed force in 1806. It was provisionally signed over to Britain at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, and with it came this huge area here, Cape Colony, not really occupied, of course, inhabited by the local native population, but claimed, of course, by the settlers here. Boers and Britons immediately found themselves at loggerheads. The Boers were fiercely independent. Their language was already different to that of the Dutch that was spoken in the Netherlands. Their religion was ferociously Old Testament Protestant, and crucially, they were also a slave-owning people. And when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, this was a trigger event for the Boers to begin a migration, or large numbers of Boers to begin a migration away from British territory, away from Cape Colony, to the east, looking for new homelands. And after a series of quite remarkable adventures on what was known as the Great Trek, this huge migration east, they eventually founded these two countries here, Transvaal in the north, and Orange Free State just to the south of it. The British, of course, soon followed the Boers east, and as the British Empire expanded, taking control of Natal, warring with the Zulus and so forth, it was inevitable that Britain and Boer would once again come into conflict. There were skirmishes in the 1840s and a significant war between the two powers in the early 1880s, the First Boer War, which actually ended in a Boer victory at the Battle of Majuba Hill, which results in a political compromise between Britain and Boer, whereby the Boers were granted their independence as these two states. And there the story may well have ended had it not been for the fact that just a few years later, some of the biggest gold and diamond deposits in the world were discovered lying within these Boer republics. The discovery of this phenomenal mineral wealth prompted a gold rush and a mining boom in these towns, and it turned these two pretty small agrarian republics into proportionately two of the richest states in the world. Inevitably, this drew the covered size of the British Empire, and tensions between the two powers rose, I should say, and relations deteriorated throughout the 1890s as Britain tried to provoke the Boers into some sort of rash action, attempts to overthrow the Boer government in a harebrained mercenary raid known as the Jameson Raid in 1895 and 96, until eventually in October 1899, the Boer governments felt they had been backed into such a corner and that they were facing an imminent invasion from British forces that the only option they had was to launch a preemptive assault upon the British to try and win battlefield victories that would allow a political compromise, as had occurred in 1880 and 81. A final word about the word Boer. It just means farmer in Afrikaans, and it was used not as a pejorative word in the 19th century or indeed afterwards. Strictly speaking, Boers are Afrikaners based upon their language, which is a unique form of Old Dutch, incorporated with a variety of other influences. But the term Boer is synonymous also with Afrikaner at this time. So in October 1899, the Boers decided that they had been backed into a corner. There was nothing else they could do apart from try and seek a battlefield victory, and they declared war upon the British Empire. What forces did they have then to actually fight this war? And here we've got a photograph of a typical Boer group of fighters here, which would be the backbone of the Boer military forces in this war. The first thing to note is that the Boers had no standing army. Their only professional branch of their army was a handful of artillerymen who were trained actually in artillery schools in France and in Germany. But the bulk of the Boer army was a militia. It was citizens who were called out in times of war, in times of crisis, and would be expected to report to a mustering depot, a marshalling area with weapons and with a horse ready for action, and also a certain amount of rations so they could stay in the field. And this was a system the Boers had used stretching right back into the 1700s, when it was necessary to defend their colonial possessions against local incursions. So they did not have a standing army, but their militia system was well developed, and men would respond vigorously to these calls. Any Boer male aged between 16 and 60 was liable to be called up for the militia in a time of crisis. And of course, on the eve of the war, the Boers summoned their militia, and at the height of their powers, the Boers could muster about 50,000 fighting men, roughly. It's difficult to be precise, but for most of the war, that number was theoretical, and it was somewhere close to perhaps 35,000 actual effective combatants. But although there was no standing army, and therefore there was no training, indeed, as you can see, these men have no uniform, they're wearing civilian clothes. There was no formal officering system, so militia groups would instead elect their own officers who'd be given a certain amount of authority. On one hand, it looked like an irregular rabble, clothed strangely with this strange system of electing officers, and it might, indeed, many in Britain thought that this irregular mob would not be able to withstand serious war. But the Boers had several key advantages that would become apparent during the conflict. The first was the gun culture of Boer citizens. The gun, or specifically the rifle in Boer culture in the late 19th century, was both a means and a metaphor for independence. Taking ownership of your first firearm was almost a rite of passage as a young man, as a teenage man. Once you'd received your first rifle and learned how to use it, that marked your elevation into the world of adulthood. It was also a practical weapon, a practical tool. You could use it to hunt, of course. There was lots of game in the Boer republics, so you could use it to feed your family. You may have to use it to defend yourself from outlaws or other incursions, because this was still something of a frontier society, especially around the edges of the South African republics, where gunplay was quite frequent. And above all else, having skill with a rifle was culturally very significant in Boer society. Indeed, one British traveller in the Boer republics in the 1890s noted that marksmanship competitions and target shooting as just a pastime, as a sport, occupied the same place for South Africans as billiards did for the London Clubland Society. So having a gun and being skilled with a gun was very, very important to Boer male society. And to add to this, the South African governments, after that botched mercenary raid, the Jameson raid over Christmas 1895 and 96, the South African governments had invested some of their mineral wealth in purchasing thousands of modern German Mauser rifles and distributing them to their population when that population responded to the militia call. So not only did you have men who were highly experienced using rifles and who reveled in their skill with these weapons, they were now equipped with the latest European rifles that were equally as effective as the British Lee Metfords and Lee Enfields that were being used at the time. As well as being crack shots and highly skilled with rifles, the Boers were also known for their tremendous mobility. The rail network of South Africa was comparatively poorly developed, with only a few major lines, which I'll discuss with you in a moment. To make up for this and to cover the vast distances of South Africa, the horse was the primary means of transport, and Boers particularly adopted what's known as the South African pony It's actually a horse, but it's a little smaller than a European horse. These were the descendants of the horses the original Dutch settlers had brought with them in the 16 and 1700s. They had evolved, they'd adapted to the South African climate. Crucially, they could eat South African foliage, which European horses often struggled to do. They were very hardy, they could endure the heat, and they were ideal mounts for getting about and travelling large distances. And when the Boers were summoned to the militia, they were expected to bring a horse, 2 horses if possible, which they could then use to ride. And it meant that the Boer fighters were essentially a force of mounted infantrymen. They would ride hard, they'd seize a position, they'd defend it with their rifles, and if they were in danger of being pushed back or overrun, they could remount their horses and move to the next position. So they were tremendously mobile and also possessed a substantial quantity of infantry firepower. And to give you some idea about the toughness of the Boers, because many of these men were rugged frontiersmen. Not all, there were plenty of urban Boers, but many were tough outdoorsmen. They were freebooters. They had a strong sense of independence. They could be adventurous. They were rugged, tough individuals, hardy men. And the units that they formed would go on to achieve fame for how effective they would actually be in battle. And this, of course, leads us to the fact that a Boer military unit, was called a commando. Now, in Afrikaans, this has no great significance. It's rather like saying a battalion or a regiment in English. But of course, the word commando has now become synonymous with special forces. And the reason this is the case is that in 1940, when Winston Churchill founded Britain's first special forces, the commandos, Winston Churchill, a veteran, of course, of this war, indeed he'd been a prisoner of war during it, he recalled the toughness, the initiative, and indeed the fighting ferocity of the Boer commandos in this war. And he deliberately chose the word commando for Britain's own special forces. And of course, we still have that today in the form of the Royal Marine Commandos. And I think that gives you some real idea about how tough these men would prove to be in battle, that in the end, Churchill would name Britain's special forces almost in honor of this most implacable of opponents of the empire. What was the British Army bringing against this in 1899? Well, one thing that we can say about the British Army was it was incredibly experienced in what it termed small wars. And small wars to the British Army were simply wars that were not fought against what we'd now call a peer opponent, so a European opponent. Indeed, during the reign of Queen Victoria, the British Army would fight no less than 230 so-called small wars. The Boer War that we're looking at today, the 226th of those wars. So the army knew what colonial warfare looked like, and it was successful in it. Indeed, defeats in colonial warfare, such as Isandlwana at the hands of the Zulus or Maiwand at the hands of the Afghans, were remembered in British cultural memory precisely because they were so unusual. For the most part, British colonial expeditions had achieved almost universal success. And though these wars could be hard fought and indeed at times could be costly, they nevertheless frequently ended in British victory. The British Army was experienced, therefore, in fighting in colonial warfare at the fringes of modern developed society and in inhospitable and very varied terrain. But what it did not have was any real experience of facing modern weaponry. Aside from some Afghans on the northwest frontier who were possessing rifles that they'd either stolen, pilfered, or purchased, the British had not had much experience facing opponents who were armed to a similar level as they. British Army's main experience had come fighting technologically inferior opponents who may well have been brave or indeed may well have been well organized and militarily efficient, such as the Zulus, for example, but lacked the technological edge that the British Army possessed. This meant that British Army tactics had evolved to deal with relatively poorly armed foes who tended to try and close into melee range. And they were not experienced in the dangers of facing modern rifle fire and modern artillery fire. And this, of course, would, in the end, cost the British Army quite dearly in those early battles against the Boers, who, as we've seen, possessed not only a professional artillery branch, but also was made up of these riflemen who certainly knew how to use their weapons. What might have offset this was British training and leadership, but the British Army at this stage was extremely inconsistent in how it approached training. Regimental colonels had a great deal of authority on how they trained their battalions, and whilst there were some enlightened and forward-thinking regimental colonels who trained their battalions hard, there were also those who did not. There were battalions that had fought in pretty stiff engagements on the northwest frontier who'd had some taste of facing modern rifle fire, and equally there were those who had not. And this meant that the army was very inconsistently trained, and there was a very inconsistent approach to leadership within these battalions, which would become apparent when the war broke out, with some battalions showing advanced skirmishing tactics, often in which they'd learned on the northwest frontier, and other battalions who'd not had the chance to train in this or learn from it, attacking almost shoulder to shoulder into the teeth of Boer rifles with predictable results. What really brought these problems together, though, was overconfidence in the British Army. Remember that the British Army has tremendously experienced in fighting in small wars. It's got a tremendous record of victories in these conflicts, and it went into the Boer War with a similar level of confidence. Early British intelligence assessments underestimated the Boers, thought that the Boers would not be as militarily significant as they had been in the 1880s, when, remember, of course, the Boers had defeated the British Army, and suggested that the war, in fact, might be over by Christmas. Now, this is something we tend to associate incorrectly with the First World War, but in October 1899, when the Boer War broke out, particularly British right-wing newspapers, such as the Daily Mail and the Spectator, claimed that the war would be over by Christmas and the British Army would simply steamroller the Boer republics. Would that be the case? Well, let's find out. And this leads us to the first great campaign of the Boer War. I'm going to look at three major campaigns in the Boer War. Most historians agree that this war can be divided into three phases. Some argue it can be divided into four, but I'm going to take a three-phase approach. And the first part of this was the campaign between October to January, so the opening months of the conflict, characterized by two features: the Boer invasion of British South Africa, and this man, General Sir Rivers Buller, VC, his campaign then to counterattack and drive the Boer invasion back. What happened in this campaign? Well, when the Boers declared war in October 1899, their immediate plan was to advance into British-held South Africa, seize key towns, seize key terrain, particularly block the rail lines to stop the British advancing against their own republics. And to this end, the Boers laid siege to this border town here, Mafeking. Notice it's on the main British railway that runs from Cape Town further north. So they besieged Mafeking. They besieged the diamond mining centre of Kimberley here, also sat on a crucial railroad, and holding Cecil Rhodes, a hate figure to the Boers of South Africa, who were very keen to capture him and possibly even put him on trial for his role in launching the Jameson raid. They also encroached into this area here, which is known as the Cape Midlands. Notice again, blocking the key railroads, which would lead into the Boer republics. And most importantly of all, they crossed into Natal, driving towards the town of Ladysmith, which again sits on the main railroad from Durban. This area, Natal, was where the main British forces in South Africa were stationed at the outbreak of the war. They'd been poorly deployed, their forces had been split, and they were unable to effectively resist the Boer invasion. Several pretty stiff battles were fought in October 1899 as the Boers fought through Natal, and the Boers didn't have it all their own way, suffering one or two stinging defeats en route. But crucially, by the end of October 1899, they had approached the outskirts of Ladysmith, where the main British forces in South Africa were stationed. At this stage, the British garrison at Ladysmith had a tough choice to make. It could fall back, it could abandon the town and all the stores that had been assembled there, fall back in the direction of Durban and await reinforcements, or it could turn and fight and try and break the Boer invasion. But of course, if it lost that battle, it would be encircled and the British would be in a dire strategic position. The commander of that garrison, Sir George White, he decided to fight. He sent his army out at the Battle of Ladysmith at the end of October 1899, but he was badly defeated in a battle that became known as Mournful Monday to the British press. His army was driven back into Ladysmith and it was encircled. And this was a crucial strategic turning point for this entire war. Within a few weeks, the Boers had effectively eliminated all the major British forces still operable in South Africa. The garrisons of Mafeking and Kimberley were small. The garrison in the Cape Midlands was small, but the main army in Ladysmith was now trapped. It had been encircled, it had failed to win the Battle of Ladysmith, and now the bulk of British forces in South Africa were encircled, and the whole of British South Africa seemed to lie open to the Boers. The Boers began to lay siege to Ladysmith, and here we can see some of the Boer artillery in siege lines around Ladysmith, where they were trying to starve the British out, interspersed with occasional bombardments from their artillery. This siege of Ladysmith was a strategic disaster for Britain. It removed all of its mobile forces, and crucially, if the Boers managed to force Ladysmith to surrender, along with those thousands of British soldiers there, this would be a massive victory for them, and it might be enough to tip the political scales in their favour and allow them to achieve a political compromise, essentially to win the war, rather as they had done in the First Boer War. And into this came Sir Reevers Buller. He was commander of Aldershot Garrison, the premier training ground for the British Army at home in the 1890s. And he and his army corps, which was around about 48,000 men, were shipped to South Africa almost as soon as the war broke out. But of course, the slow voyage south meant that they arrived after these critical events, the Boer invasion, had already occurred and Ladysmith was under siege. Now, Buller's original plan was to mass his forces essentially around Durban and drive straight into the Boer republics. The Boer capital of Pretoria here, that's the capital of Transvaal, and the Boer capital of Bloemfontein here would be cut off from one another by this drive. But the sieges of these towns, particularly Kimberley and Ladysmith, not to mention the Boer incursion into the Cape Midlands, prevented this plan being carried out. And so instead, Buller was forced to make a difficult and arguably ill-advised, but perhaps unavoidable decision. He needed to split his army corps into three parts to deal with these three separate problems. He dispatched one part of his force under Lord Methuen to try and fight its way towards Kimberley. Another part under William Gatacre was going to secure the Cape Midlands area and stop the Boer incursion here, whereas Buller himself would take the bulk of the army and he would fight through to relieve the siege of Ladysmith. Unfortunately for Buller and his subordinate commanders, all three of these armies ran into trouble very quickly, and all three suffered serious battlefield defeats in a single week in December 1899, between the 10th of December 1899 and the 15th of December 1899. Methuen, after some victories fighting his way down the rail line, eventually ran into serious trouble at the Battle of Magersfontein, where he walked into a Boer ambush essentially, and his units were pinned down and then ultimately routed from a barren plain. Gatacre, operating in the Cape Midlands, attempted a complex night march to outflank and surprise the Boers around the area of Stormberg, completely got it wrong. His forces got lost in the night, blundered into the Boer lines at dawn, and were routed with severe losses. And most notoriously of all, Buller, trying to fight his way towards Ladysmith through rugged terrain across the Tugela River, was defeated at the Battle of Colenso, a stinging defeat which included the loss of 10 Royal Artillery guns, the heaviest loss of Royal Artillery pieces since the Napoleonic Wars. This period became known as Black Week in the British press, and think about how shocking this would have been to the British public, a British public that had been used to victories, used to tales of success in the empire, suddenly to hear that 3 British armies had been defeated in the space of 5 days, and defeated badly as well, with heavy casualties. This was a shocking occurrence. So what had gone wrong? And this is a photograph actually from the Battle of Spion-Kop that was fought in January, another British defeat as Buller tried to fight his way through to Ladysmith. Several factors explain British setbacks at this period. First of all, Buller and his subordinates were operating under severe time pressure. Everything that they planned for the campaign had been thrown out of the window by the loss of the main British army being trapped at Ladysmith. Under severe political pressure to get moving, and also unsure about how long the besieged towns would be able to hold out. And remember, the British can't afford to have those besieged towns surrender. It would be a political disaster. Buller and his subordinates had to rush their campaign. They had to rush into the attack without proper preparations. And also they had to rush into Boer defensive positions, which the Boers had had time to prepare. Another problem was that nearly all the British cavalry, all the British mounted troops in South Africa had been trapped at Ladysmith, where of course they could do nothing. And it meant that Buller's Aldershot Corps, when it arrived and it split into its component parts, was seriously deficient in cavalry. In a vast wilderness such as large parts of South Africa were at this time, scouting and reconnaissance has to be done on horseback. And remember how mobile the Boers are too. It's easy for them to blind scouts, to pick them off. This lack of mounted troops in Buller's component armies meant the reconnaissance of the Boer positions was really poor, and frequently the British walked into ambushes or even assaulted into Boer positions that they barely understood. We see this at Colenso, we see this at Magersfontein as well, and the consequences of this were severe. British infantry mown down by hidden Boers and shot up by concealed Boer artillery. And finally, let's not forget that, as I hope I've made clear to you, the Boers were formidable fighters. They've been able to prepare defensive positions, awaiting the British assaults, knowing that the British would have to attack in this direction. And the Boers had prepared considerable earthworks. They'd entrenched themselves. They concealed their positions. And as the British couldn't detect these positions, they simply had to assault into them with predictable consequences. One British journalist attached to Buller's army memorably recalled these campaigns as nothing but an honest, straightforward British march into a row of waiting rifles. And this, sadly, was often the experience of British assaults in the opening parts of the war. With all of the relief forces defeated, Britain faced a strategic crisis. It could do one of two things. It could make a political compromise with the Boers, as it had done in 1881 after its defeat at Majuba Hill, or it could redouble its efforts and try and reinforce the army and seek a decision. Of course, Britain chose the latter. Aware of Schadenfreude emanating from Europe, aware of its risky strategic position, aware of the dangers to the wider empire if it was seen to be defeated in South Africa, the British government called for volunteers and redoubled its efforts to win this war. And so in some ways, the Boer successes in Black Week, those battlefield victories, perhaps actually doomed their cause. This leads us to the second phase of the war. This is Lord Roberts, VC, one of the most famous soldiers in Britain at the time, and the British invasion of the Boer republics between January 1900 and November 1900. Roberts was assigned to take command of the faltering British campaign in South Africa soon after Black Week. And he received this offer to take command of the British army there, still mourning the death of his only son, Freddie, who'd been mortally wounded at the Battle of Colenso and died just a few days later. Roberts, as one of the most famous soldiers in the British Empire, a hero of the British Empire, was now assigned to take charge of a vastly increased army. Reinforcements flowed into South Africa. Regular battalions were recalled from around the empire, but more than that, Britain's auxiliary forces were mobilised. The yeomanry, the militia, and the volunteers would send forces to South Africa. And crucially and unusually, volunteers flowed in from the wider British Empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and also British South Africa, providing an imperial contingent that would also fight alongside regular British soldiers. And with this vastly increased army, perhaps 100,000 strong by the end of January 1900, Roberts was going to turn the tide of the war. This led to a new series of campaigns. The British forces were building up throughout January 1900. Buller still fighting down in, trying to fight his way through to Ladysmith, of course, suffering defeats at Spion-Kop and also at the Battle of Valkrans, while Roberts mustered his forces to the southwest of Kimberley. And as I've mentioned, vastly increased military size. Whereas Buller had about 50,000 men to work with, Roberts's army increased to a size of about 100,000, so more than double the number of soldiers Bullard had available. And Roberts's plan was to, rather than trying to batter his way through to Kimberley, instead he would use his vastly increased cavalry. He now had about 9,000 cavalry, so far more than Bullard ever had, to outflank the Boers, actually outflank the Boer siege lines, force them to retreat, and then sweep into the Boer republics towards Bloemfontein, the Orange Free State capital, and then sweeping up that rail line towards Johannesburg. Meanwhile, Johannesburg and Pretoria. Johannesburg, the largest city in South Africa, Pretoria, the capital of Transvaal. Meanwhile, Buller would continue to fight through towards Ladysmith and continue to try and relieve the army there. But the time pressure now was less. With so many British soldiers in South Africa, even if Ladysmith had been forced to surrender, if it had run out of food, there was still enough British soldiers here to turn the tide of war. A few points for you to notice. Paardeberg, which I'll be talking about in a moment, Bloemfontein and Pretoria, and this area here, the Brandwater Basin, which I'll also be covering. Lord Roberts launched his invasion in February 1900, outflanking the Boer position at Kimberley, surprising the Boer defenders there, who then had to start to fall back. And this set in stage a series of events that would lead to a highly successful fortnight for British forces. By outflanking Kimberley using his greater mobility and abandoning that fixed route on the rail lines, Roberts surprised the Boers. The Boers abandoned the siege of Kimberley and tried to fall back to cover their capital of Bloemfontein. But in the process, they got caught. They were surrounded by British and indeed British Imperial forces at this battle, the Battle of Paardeberg. Boer forces dug themselves in along a riverbank, but found themselves surrounded by British forces. And over the coming week or more, a sort of siege in the field took place as the British gradually fought their way closer and closer to the entrenched Boers who'd formed a wagon laager. It circled the wagons and were clinging on with no real hope of escape, but it's not really clear what the Boers hoped to achieve here. There was an opportunity for the Boers to break out at one point, but they didn't take it. And gradually the British fought their way closer and closer at high cost, it must be said. This was pretty bitter fighting. But by the end of this period, the 27th of February, Boer forces at Paardeberg surrendered. Several thousand Boer fighters were forced to lay down their arms, the most significant capture of Boer forces at this point, up to this point of the war. The siege of Kimberley was broken, and of course, Bloemfontein was now uncovered and was ripe for the picking for the British Army. It was a significant and surprising victory. Just a day after the Boer forces surrendered at Paardeberg, Buller and his army finally broke through the Tegela line, finally broke through the Boer defences there at a prolonged battle known as the Battle of the Tegela Heights, almost a First World War battle with lots of artillery, trenches and step-by-step assaults. Finally, the Boer defences there collapsed. The Boers had to abandon the siege of Ladysmith and they fell back to the north, and Buller and his forces were able to make contact with the besieged garrison, which of course had been under siege since the end of October 1899, and relieve Ladysmith. Things would get worse for the Boers. The Bloemfontein fell without a fight in April 1900. It couldn't be covered, it couldn't be protected, and the British simply marched in. And then they proceeded to move down the railroad further north until eventually they marched again into Pretoria, the second capital of the Boer republics, on the 5th of June 1900, again without a fight, occupying without a fight. Boer forces seemingly powerless to stop this overwhelming British advance as it moved through the Boer countryside. There were battles fought during this period, notably the Battle of Diamond Hill in June 1900, but the Boers were now greatly outnumbered, and the vast numbers of British cavalry could constantly seek the Boer flanks, turn them out of their positions, and force the Boers to fall back. The Boers were essentially in disarray throughout the summer of 1900. And this culminated on the 29th of July, when, if you remember, I marked that position to the east of Bloemfontein, Brandwater Basin. The bulk of the Orange Free State Army, which had fallen back from Bloemfontein and had founded a new capital at Brandwater Basin, the bulk of the Orange Free State Army was here. It had been cut off from the Transvaal Army to the north. It was still clinging on, but it was encircled in July 1900 in somewhat controversial circumstances. The Boers didn't really put up much of a fight, and there's some suggestion their commandants, their commanders, had already given up. And the bulk of the Orange Free State Army was surrounded and forced to surrender. And here we can see them laying down their weapons to the British and marching away. Not into captivity, I might add, actually returning to their homes, having been divested of their weapons and any military equipment. But this was another significant blow. And all this meant was, by the end of July 1900, between February and July 1900, the Boers had had a series of disasters. They'd been defeated in battle, they'd lost their capitals, their countries had been overrun, and their armed forces seemed powerless to resist the relentless march of these vastly numerically superior British forces. What were the key things then that underpinned British success in this period? And here we've got a wonderful photo. It's a posed photograph, but a wonderful photograph nevertheless, of British forces. These are actually Canadians. You can see the maple leaf on their helmet, scaling a copy, a South African hill. First and foremost, the British now had a huge numerical advantage. Perhaps 100,000 British fighting soldiers against perhaps 35,000 Boers. And that number of Boers would decline, of course, as men surrendered and as men were killed and wounded in battle, and as men simply deserted. Seeing that the war was going against them, a number of Boers simply chose to go home. That numerical advantage could not be countered by the Boers. The Boers themselves were becoming war-weary. A series of defeats, setbacks, and just the intense and prolonged nature of the fighting was starting to exhaust this army. Remember, it's not a fully trained army. It doesn't have a professional officer or NCO corps. These are civilians, not even in uniform. These are civilian fighters, and exhaustion began to take a toll. The discipline and morale of the Boer armies starts to crumble in the summer of 1900, and the Boer forces start to disintegrate. They're not prepared for this level of intensity and this prolonged nature of this fighting. And crucially too, the British have learned and improved have learned from their mistakes, and they've improved their tactics. There's a widespread tactical reform actually started by Lord Roberts in early 1900 that then filters through the entire British Army. Tactics are overhauled, they're made much more practical, they're much more realistic, and they're much more effective for fighting against an enemy armed with modern weapons. And so by November 1900, when Roberts goes home, a hero to a celebrating British public, the war seems over. The Boer armies are scattered, they're shattered even. The Boer capitals are under British control and the Boer republics have been overrun. But of course, the war does not end. And this leads us into the third and final phase that I'm going to look at today. And this is the guerrilla war. And this man, Lord Kitchener's campaign against it. Lord Kitchener had been Roberts's chief of staff, and he took over after Roberts went home back to Britain. This takes place between March 1900 and May 1902. And the keen-eyed amongst you will notice there's an overlap here between Roberts's campaign, his invasion, and this guerrilla war. Why is that the case? It's because of this, the decision at Kronstadt on the 17th of March 1900. In the aftermath of Boer defeats at the gates of Ladysmith and the Battle of Paardeberg, particularly Orange Free State commandos and leaders, but also representatives from Transvaal, gathered together at Kronstadt in the Orange Free State, held a war council and decided how they were going to start to prosecute the war. The decision made here was that the British armies were simply too big to fight in pitched battles. And from now on, the Boer commandos, remember that's an individual unit of Boers, would abandon their heavy equipment, their artillery and their wagons, and would instead just focus on being a very light, mobile raiding force, a guerrilla force, in fact, that would try and operate behind British lines, would strike at British railroads, and would ambush isolated British units. Not every Boer leader and commando agreed to this. Remember, Pretoria is still in Boer hands at this time, and Transvaalers in particular decided they were going to try and defend it conventionally. But many other Boer commandos agreed to this policy. And this led to a dispersion of a number of commandos, individual units that could be anything between 50 men to perhaps 350 men strong, who would start to operate behind British lines. And already, in fact, the British advance had cut off some Boer forces that were operating behind British lines. These forces just continued to wage a guerrilla war. But the decision at Kronstadt to adopt a guerrilla approach to try and wear down the British through guerrilla attacks and guerrilla sabotage was crucial to prolonging the war. And of course, this was made whilst conventional battles were still being fought, but it began a process. And immediately this process had success. Boer guerrilla raids on railways and on supply trains that were operating behind British lines proved devastatingly effective. And furthermore, mobile Boer guerrillas could actually start moving into British-held territory, into Cape Colony, into Natal, causing havoc, causing disarray, and sowing discord and disruption wherever they went. And the success of the Boer guerrillas that was evident between March and April 1900 would inspire other Boer commandos to turn to this route after the fall of Pretoria in June 1900 and the last defeats of the Boer conventional armies in July and August. And so by August, September 1900, all the remaining Boer commandos in the field had officially adopted guerrilla tactics, and they would carry out their guerrilla campaign, not merely in the Boer republics, but would take the fight almost to the gates of Cape Town and the gates of Durban itself. They would roam wherever they chose over South Africa, striking isolated British outposts, sabotaging railways, and causing as much havoc as they possibly could. And against this grueling guerrilla campaign, the British were initially at a loss about how to deal with it. The British had not anticipated this type of guerrilla fighting, and their response to it became increasingly brutal as the war went on. The initial response of the British was to undertake a scorched earth campaign against Boer towns, villages and farms that were felt to be supporting Boer guerrilla fighters by providing refuge or providing food. These farms would simply be burned down, and the civilians who lived there, women and children mainly, would simply be thrown out onto the veldt, into South African wilderness. The idea initially was that these women and children would join the commandos, would slow them down, would exhaust them, would encourage the commandos to surrender. But in fact, seeing women and children isolated and out in the wild simply enraged the commandos and made them fight all the harder. It also created a refugee crisis for the British. As more and more towns and farms were burned, more and more refugees were created, and these women and children wandering the countryside were of course at risk from the elements, from hostile locals, and are simply being caught up in the sorrows of war. And this led to the British beginning one of the most controversial aspects of the Boer War, and this was the creation of concentration camps. Concentration camps in the Boer War are greatly misunderstood by a modern audience, and we tend to think of them in terms of the concentration camps in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. And that is an incorrect comparison to make. Initially, British concentration camps were for Boer refugees who had surrendered to the British and were afraid of reprisals from loyalist Boers, shall we say. So Boer refugees trying to flee from the possibility of reprisals came into British territory and needed to be housed. And they were initially set up in concentration camps as a temporary measure. But then this situation got worse as the British created a refugee crisis through destroying farms and towns. More and more civilians had to be brought into British lines for their own safety, and they were put into a growing number of concentration camps. These camps were poorly run. They had poor sanitation and they had inadequate medical facilities. And by grouping such a large number of civilians together, disease outbreaks were inevitable, particularly diseases that were largely unknown or were difficult to resist for frontier societies, measles, cholera, and so forth. The result was a humanitarian disaster. At least 27,000 Boer women and children died in concentration camps, and probably the same number of black civilians died in separate concentration camps for Africans that were also set up. But the important point to take from this is concentration camps were not designed to do this. This was a failure of administration. It was a failure of planning. It was a failure of organization. Disgraceful, undoubtedly, but it's important to separate this from the concentration camps of the 1930s that were deliberately designed to kill, degrade, and indeed eradicate culture. These were not the concentration camps of South Africa. Appalling as they were and as dreadful as they were never intended to do this. And it was largely due to British incompetence and then a certain degree of callousness that they continued. Worse, in some ways, was to come. As the guerrilla war continued, the British increasingly adopted a policy of summary execution, whereby Boer prisoners who were captured with elements of British equipment on them that they would have looted from captured or killed British soldiers would be summarily executed on the grounds that they must have killed a British soldier to have taken this. Similarly, Boers who originally hailed from the Cape Colony, because there was a substantial Boer population still in British territory. Boers from this area who were captured by the British would be similarly executed for being rebels against British rule. And the opposite also became true. Boer commandos roaming across the countryside freely executed and murdered Boer civilians who did not join them or who were felt to be helping the British. They freely terrorized black civilians, looting their villages and so forth, taking food and what they needed. And also there's some evidence of them quite freely shooting captured British soldiers as well. Classic examples of the growing violence, bitterness and intensity of insurgency warfare as both sides turned on each other and the normal rules of war were lost. And perhaps the most famous example of this is the actions of the Australian soldier Breaker Morant, eventually put on trial for the murder of Boer prisoners and indeed civilians in the war zone, executed by firing squad, but defended his actions on the grounds that this was standard practice in the British Army, what was described as Rule 303, of course referring to the .303 caliber bullet used by the British. In many ways, Breaker Morant was correct. Whilst Breaker Morant was being put on trial, Douglas Haig, future Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, was writing almost gleefully to his sister, Henrietta, telling her how he and his forces have been freely executing captured Boer prisoners. And so there certainly is something to be said that Breaker Morant became a scapegoat of the empire. But let's not forget he was also a murderer, not merely of combatants, but also of civilians. And amidst all this, the native population of South Africa, and by this I mean the Xhosa, the Zulu and other African tribes, were increasingly drawn into the conflict. The Boers and the British have been very keen to keep a separation between these two, between the whites, if you will, the Boers and the British, and the black African population. They didn't want this to turn into a racial war, but the growing chaos of the war, Boer incursions into Zululand, Zulu incursions against the Boers, and more besides, was increasingly bringing black Africans into the conflict. Furthermore, the British freely recruited black Africans as drivers, as laborers, and increasingly as guides and scouts. Perhaps as many as 15,000 black Africans were brought into the British Army during the conflict, very much antagonizing the Boers, who of course feared the consequences of a racial war. And the war became more and more violent and more widespread throughout 1900 and 1902, eventually resulting in Liberal leader Campbell-Bannerman, the leader of the opposition, condemning the government for conducting the war through methods of barbarism. How did the war eventually come to an end? A number of factors eventually turned the war to the British, towards a British victory. First of all, counterinsurgency tactics, initially appalling and incompetently practiced by the British, slowly but steadily improved. More and more control of areas, more and more focus on bringing normalcy back to areas, and rather less simply running around the countryside looking for Boers. Crucial to this was the introduction of the blockhouse system, and you can see a blockhouse here and its garrison around it. The British built over 8,000 blockhouses, earth and corrugated iron small constructions that held a garrison of perhaps 6 to 8 men that were positioned within along crucial areas, so rail lines and river lines, with barbed wire between them. And of course, this prevented Boer movement. The Boers found it very difficult to take these blockhouses. They couldn't cross the barbed wire without being detected. And this slowly but surely constrained Boer movement. This was the largest construction in South Africa of fortifications that had ever been seen. As I say, about 8,000 blockhouses were built in various lines along rail lines and river lines, but they did have an effect of gradually choking the ability of the Boers to move. The Boers too were becoming exhausted after years of war. The surviving commandos became known as the bitter enders, the last few who were still fighting. And indeed, by the very later stages of the war in 1902, there were probably more Boers serving with the British as guides, as irregulars, as light horse and so forth, than there were Boers still in the commando units. There was a definite willingness within South Africa to simply bring this war to an end. And even the surviving Boer fighters had become battered and exhausted, finding it harder and harder to secure supplies, their physical health declining, and it becoming quite clear a victory was going to be impossible. And on top of this, when negotiations finally were settled in May 1902, the British were willing to negotiate relatively lenient peace terms, in particular willing to make compromises to the Boers about the idea of black citizenship. Initially, one of Britain's war aims was to elevate black citizens to the same level as white South Africans. The Boers were willing to accept all elements of the British peace treaty apart from that, and the British were willing to strike it out, which secured a peace treaty at the end of May 1902, bringing a long, bitter and bloody war to an end. Casualties, perhaps 100,000 British casualties in total, of whom about 25,000 died, most of them from disease, it must be said. Boer casualties, harder to compute. Perhaps 9,000 combatants killed, and we might say perhaps 3 times that many wounded. Civilian casualties, at least 27,000 Boer civilians died in concentration camps, and probably a similar number of black civilians died in their concentration camps. This had been a bloody and a bitter and a prolonged war that would leave scars on both South Africa and Britain. I'd like to conclude by just briefly offering a few legacies that this war left that would have profound effect on Britain and its empire. The first was the move towards national efficiency in Britain and the empire. The idea that the British manpower had been physically deficient in the Boer War was a widespread one. Many volunteers for the war had to be turned away due to being small or in poor health. And so this gave rise to the national efficiency movement, an idea of improving the health of the British and by in extension the British Empire's citizens, and would ultimately lead the way for the Liberal government's famous reforming agenda in the mid-1900s, in the Edwardian period, that would lay the grounds of what would eventually become the welfare state in Britain. The war proved that volunteerism was alive and well in Britain and the Empire. The incredible reaction to the call for men that was issued after Black Week surprised the British government and delighted the British government in many ways. That volunteers had come from as far afield as Canada, Newfoundland and New Zealand, etc., showed that there was a unity within the empire and that British citizens would respond in a time of crisis. And of course, we'll see the culmination of this process in 1914 and 1915, when a new wave of volunteers, of course, goes to the war in France and Flanders. On a strategic level, the revelation of Britain's weaknesses, particularly its lack of friends in Europe, pushed Britain out of splendid isolation, or the so-called period of splendid isolation, and started a search for allies and friends. An alliance with Japan in 1902 followed, and the Entente Cordiale, the friendly understanding with France in 1904 followed, bringing Britain into European alliance, the European alliance system, and in some ways paving the way for that ultimate showdown between the Central Powers and the Entente powers that would occur in 1914. And finally, it wouldn't be fair of me to end this talk without mentioning there was a major and lasting reform of the British Army between 1902 and 1914. A total overhaul of tactics, training and equipment in the British Army, a complete overhaul of its organisation, introducing a new auxiliary force, the Territorial Force, and much more besides. But if you'd like to know more about that, I do invite you to read my book on the subject, From Boer War to World War,